The Dark Scrolls. In the summer of 1462, Castile lay beneath a sky that burned like molten bronze, the sun's relentless blaze turning the whitewashed walls of its capital into mirrors of heat. The royal palace stood on a hill above the city, a fortress of stone and ceremony, its towers rising like pale sentinels against the shimmering horizon. From the outside, it looked untouched by the troubles of the world, majestic, unyielding. But behind its high walls, an invisible nightmare was spreading through corridors and chambers like a poison in the blood. The court had done something almost unthinkable. Every window in the palace had been sealed, planked over, nailed shut, and in some cases, bricked entirely. From the street below, it seemed as if the building had turned its face from the world, hiding from something too terrible to name. The reason for this suffocating lockdown was not an invading army, not a siege or a storm, but a single person, a princess of the blood, who was alive, yet rotting from within. Her name, whispered with dread, rarely passed the lips of courtiers now. Before her illness, she had been a figure of radiance in the court, young, graceful, the kind of beauty that poets compared to dawn over the olive groves. She had been educated in languages, music, and the politics of her father's realm. Her laughter had filled the stone halls like the music of bells, and her presence had drawn admirers and alliances. But the woman who now lay in the darkened chamber at the heart of the palace bore little resemblance to that image. The transformation had been gradual at first, almost invisible, a fever that lingered, a pallor that did not fade. Then came the smell. It began as something faint, something that could be dismissed as a passing illness or the heat of summer on heavy fabrics. But as the weeks passed, the scent grew heavier, sharper, until it was no longer something the mind could ignore. It clung to everything, the princess's gowns, her bedclothes, the air itself. No one knew exactly what affliction gripped her. Physicians summoned from every corner of the realm offered theories, each cloaked in the language of their age. Some spoke of corrupt humors, of black bile overwhelming the body. Others whispered of gangrene, of flesh dying while the heart still beat. There were those who dared to suggest divine punishment, a curse sent down for sins unknown. None of these explanations could ease the horror of what they saw and smelled. Her skin, once smooth and pale, began to break and weep in places, the flesh beneath darkening, softening, until it seemed to give way under the lightest touch. The stench was overpowering. It was not merely the scent of sickness, but the smell of decay itself, the smell of a body surrendering to rot while life stubbornly clung to it. The princess's chambers had been moved deeper into the palace, away from public view, in an attempt to contain the horror. Tapestries hung thick over the walls to trap the smell, and braziers burned constantly with herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, mixed with the harsher scents of camphor and vinegar. Bowls of rose water were set beneath her bed, and her attendants wore small pouches of crushed juniper berries around their necks. But nothing could mask the truth. The odor found every crack, every seam, seeping out into the hallways like a living thing. Those who passed near her chamber would pause mid-step, their faces tightening, their breath held until they reached a place where the air was clean again. The sealing of the windows came after a particularly disastrous incident. One warm evening, a breeze from the city found its way into the great hall, carrying with it not the fragrance of summer but the unmistakable stench from the princess's rooms. Nobles gagged behind their gloved hands, courtiers stumbled out into the courtyard. The king himself was said to have turned pale, his jaw clenched in shame and fury. That very night, masons and carpenters were brought in under torchlight. The work began immediately. Nails hammered into wooden shutters, plaster spread thick over cracks, bricks laid in window frames until not a sliver of air could pass through. By dawn, the palace had become an airless tomb, its connection to the outside world severed. The ceiling did nothing to heal the princess, but it prevented the scandal from spreading beyond the palace walls. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavy in more ways than one. Without the relief of open windows, the summer heat pooled in every chamber. Sweat beaded on foreheads, silks clung to damp skin, candles guttered in the thick air. Servants moved like shadows, their faces drawn, their eyes averted. Conversations became whispers, laughter vanished entirely. Even the sound of footsteps seemed to soften, as if the building itself were holding its breath. At the center of this oppressive silence lay the princess, her once bright eyes now dulled, her voice reduced to a faint rasp. She drifted in and out of fever dreams, murmuring to people who were not there, sometimes calling for her mother, long dead, sometimes for the sea she had once visited as a child. The women who cared for her were trapped in their own private hell. Bound by duty and affection, they stayed by her side despite the constant assault on their senses. They bathed her gently, trying to wash away the foulness that seemed to spring up faster than they could remove it. They changed her linens twice, sometimes 3 times a day, each time carrying the soiled cloths to be burned in the palace furnaces. They fanned her in the heat, brought her cool water infused with mint, and tried to coax her to eat. But food lost its meaning for her. Bread, fruit, even the richest custard slid untouched from her tray. She seemed to shrink into the bed, her bones pressing against skin that no longer held the blush of life. Outside her chamber, the court wrestled with fear and superstition. Rumors ran wild. Some claimed she had been poisoned by a rival faction. Others whispered of an ancient curse, the kind that lingered in royal bloodlines for generations. A few even murmured that she was no longer truly alive, that she was some unholy thing kept breathing by forces unknown. The church, cautious in its pronouncements, sent a confessor to her side, a man of quiet demeanor who stayed with her for hours at a time. What words passed between them, no one knew. But when he left her chamber, his eyes were wet, and his hands trembled as he blessed those he passed. Beyond the palace walls, the city buzzed with speculation. The ceiling of the windows had not gone unnoticed. Merchants, servants, and visiting dignitaries all wondered what could be so shameful or dangerous that the royal family would shut itself off from the air itself. Some imagined political intrigue, a secret execution, or a hidden treasure. But those who had caught even a fleeting hint of the truth, a guard who had carried messages, a laundress who had seen the soiled linens, spoke of it only in hushed tones, crossing themselves as they did. For the king, the situation was a nightmare with no clear escape. To send his daughter away would be to expose her and the royal family to public scandal. To keep her within the palace was to subject everyone to the slow torture of watching her waste away. He chose isolation, and with it came a strange form of mourning, a grief that could not be openly expressed because she still lived. Courtiers avoided the wing where she lay, and those who had once courted her favor now found excuses to remain elsewhere in the palace or away from court altogether. Her betrothal, once a matter of heated political negotiation, dissolved in silence. And still the days stretched on. The summer sun blazed outside, but inside the palace, time felt suspended, trapped in the same heavy air that carried the princess's scent. The ceiling of the windows had created not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. The court became a world unto itself, cut off from the rhythms of the city, from the turning of the seasons, from the future. Every day began and ended with the same dread. Would this be the day she finally slipped away? Or worse, would she linger yet another day, her body continuing its slow betrayal? It is said that in those weeks, even the music of the court fell silent. The lutes and viols were put away, the singers dismissed. No one could bear the sound of joy in such a place. Instead, the only music was the low murmur of attendants, the creak of wooden carts carrying supplies, and from time to time, the faint moan of the princess drifting through the darkened halls. In the evenings, the scent grew stronger, as though the heat of the day had drawn it out of the very walls. Some courtiers took to sleeping in distant parts of the palace, preferring the discomfort of small, unadorned rooms to the suffocating luxury of the main apartments. For the princess herself, each day was a battle fought in silence. She must have known, in moments of clarity, what was happening to her. She would ask sometimes if the windows were open, and her attendants would lie, telling her the weather was too hot or the air too damp. Perhaps she understood the truth and chose not to press them. In her more lucid moments, she spoke of memories, riding in the countryside, the feel of the wind in her hair, the scent of orange blossoms in spring. Those memories became her only escape from the darkened chamber, her way of breathing air that no longer reached her. The sealing of the windows was, in the end, as much a metaphor as a measure. It was the court's attempt to wall off the inevitable, to deny the natural decay that claims all living things. But the truth seeped through, as it always does, through cracks in the plaster and whispers in the night. And in that sealed palace, under the weight of heat and secrecy, the princess rotted on, not yet dead, but no longer wholly alive, suspended in a space where time itself seemed to rot along with her. The days that followed in the sealed palace passed like shadows moving over a sundial, slow and inevitable. The summer heat did not relent. It pressed its palm against the walls, turning the air inside into something thick enough to taste. Every breath was work, and the scent of rot soaked into curtains, tapestries, and the very grain of the wooden beams lingered like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Those who had once taken pride in their service to the royal household now moved with bowed heads, eyes on the floor, speaking only when spoken to. The palace, once the beating heart of Castilian politics and culture, had become a tomb that housed a living body. The princess's illness deepened in ways no one dared describe aloud. Her skin, already mottled and discolored, began to slough in places where it had been under pressure for too long. Attendants who changed her bedding would later stand at the furnaces, burning the linens as quickly as possible to keep the smell from drifting. The court physicians, powerless and increasingly unwilling to be near her, prescribed ever stranger remedies. One suggested wrapping her in cloth soaked in wine. Another recommended dusting her wounds with powdered silver. None of it worked. Instead, the treatments seemed only to agitate her condition, and the smell intensified, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. By now, the entire court understood that the princess was not going to recover. But no one could say it outright, for to do so would be to admit failure, not just of medicine, but of royal destiny. A princess was meant to be the embodiment of health, beauty, and the divine right of her bloodline. She was meant to inspire loyalty in her subjects and desire in her suitors. To acknowledge that she was lying in a darkened room, consumed by decay, was to strip away one of the court's most important illusions. So the court clung to silence, even as the truth became impossible to ignore. Beyond the palace walls, rumors multiplied like flies. Merchants in the marketplace whispered of a plague locked inside the royal residence. Some claimed the princess had been bitten by a venomous serpent during a hunt. Others insisted she had been cursed by a Moorish sorcerer, a tale that fit neatly into the kingdom's existing fears and prejudices. The church, careful not to anger the crown, issued no public statement, but priests in parishes far from the capital began adding special prayers for the royal family into their services. Each prayer was a small public acknowledgement that something was terribly wrong. Inside the sealed palace, life adjusted to the new reality. Meals were taken in smaller groups, in rooms as far from the princess's wing as possible. Courtiers no longer gathered in the great hall for conversation or music. Instead, alliances were formed in whispers behind closed doors. The king withdrew into his private chambers, seeing fewer and fewer visitors, his face becoming a mask of controlled grief. His counselors, unsure how to proceed, focused on matters of state that could be handled without his direct presence. But even these discussions seemed muted, weighed down by the unspoken knowledge that the royal line was under a shadow. The attendants assigned to the princess's care bore the heaviest burden. Each day they washed her with cloths dipped in cool water, trying to ease the constant fever that burned through her. They applied unguents meant to soothe the open sores, though the skin beneath often came away with the dressing. They changed her position in the bed to prevent further breakdown, but the damage had already been done. In quieter moments, when her breathing was steady and her eyes half closed, they would tell her stories of the outside world, descriptions of the gardens in bloom, the sound of the fountains, the laughter of children in the courtyards. It was a fiction, for the gardens had been left untended in the heat, the fountains silenced to conserve water, and the courtyards abandoned. But the attendants understood that in the mind of the princess, these details could create a refuge, a place untouched by her suffering. Her voice, when she spoke, had grown weaker, a thin thread that could be lost in the hum of a fly's wings. Yet she sometimes asked after the court, wanting to know who had visited, what alliances had been made, whether the upcoming harvest would be good. These were the questions of someone still tethered to her role, still aware that she was more than her illness, even as her body betrayed her. When her attendants answered, they chose their words carefully, giving her small pieces of good news where they could, avoiding anything that might trouble her. In return, she would sometimes smile faintly, and for a moment her eyes would hold the light they had once possessed. The sealing of the windows had brought with it other consequences, less visible but no less real. The lack of fresh air meant that illness began to spread among those who remained in the palace. Coughs became common, fevers flared and faded. Some whispered that the princess's condition was contagious, though no one outside her chamber had developed symptoms like hers. Still, the fear lingered. Servants began to leave their posts under various pretexts, slipping away to relatives in the countryside. Replacements were found, but they rarely lasted long, and the constant turnover meant that the routines of the palace grew more and more disordered. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that the king made a decision that would mark the court forever. He ordered that no one, not even family members, be allowed to see the princess unless they had an essential role in her care. This decree was delivered in person by the king's chamberlain, a man whose voice had never trembled before but did so now. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some courtiers felt relief, spared from the obligation of visiting her. Others were outraged, insisting that it was inhumane to deny her the comfort of familiar faces. But the king's word was final, and from that day on the princess's world narrowed further, until it consisted only of her attendants, the confessor, and the occasional visit from the chief physician. The confessor became her most constant visitor. He was a man of middle years, with a lined face and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. He would sit beside her for hours, speaking softly, sometimes reading from scripture, sometimes simply listening as she spoke of her fears. She confessed to him dreams in which she walked through the palace gardens, only to find them overgrown and silent. She spoke of hearing voices in the night, calling her name from beyond the sealed windows. Whether these were the products of fever or something more, the confessor never said. But those who saw him after these visits noted that he often left her chamber pale, as if the air inside had taken something from him. Meanwhile, the political life of the court could not be entirely paused. Messages still arrived from neighboring kingdoms, envoys still sought audiences, and decisions still had to be made about the governance of the realm. Yet all of it took place under the pall of the princess's illness. Potential marriage alliances, once eagerly pursued, were quietly set aside. The possibility of a royal wedding, a celebration that could unite factions and strengthen the crown, was now a fading dream. In its place came whispers of succession, of which branch of the family might rise if the princess were to die without heirs. These conversations were dangerous, and those who engaged in them did so behind locked doors, their voices low. As the summer deepened, so too did the sense of unreality within the palace. The outside world became a distant concept, something that existed only in memory. The city below could have been thriving or burning, and the courtiers might never have known. The sealed windows allowed no breeze, no sound of market stalls or church bells, no scent of rain on the cobblestones. It was as if the palace had been cut adrift, floating in a void where time moved in circles rather than forward. The princess, in her bed, seemed to embody this stasis, alive yet moving inexorably toward an end that no one could hasten or delay. There were moments, rare but memorable, when she would seem almost herself again. On one such evening, as the sun sank beyond the horizon and the candles were lit, she asked for a lute to be brought to her. An attendant, hesitant but willing, fetched it from another chamber and placed it in her hands. Her fingers, though thin and trembling, found the strings, and a soft melody filled the room. Those who heard it later swore that for a few minutes the air seemed lighter, the smell less oppressive, as if the music had pushed back the rot. When she finished, she smiled faintly and said, "I wanted to remember what it felt like to be alive." Then she set the lute aside, closed her eyes, and did not speak again for the rest of the night. But such moments were fleeting, and the reality always returned. The sores on her body deepened, the fever raged. The physicians tried bleeding her, claiming it would balance her humors. The attendants protested, but their voices carried no weight against the authority of men who had studied at the great universities of Salamanca and Bologna. The bleeding weakened her further, and after that, she rarely had the strength to lift her head from the pillow. Still, she clung to life, as if some part of her refused to let go, even when everything else had given way. By the time the first leaves began to turn in the palace gardens, unseen by the princess, the court had entered a kind of collective trance. Days blended into nights, conversations into silences. The smell, once shocking, had become part of the fabric of life in the sealed palace. Those who had lived with it for months could almost forget it for short stretches, until a change in the air brought it back with sudden force. It was a reminder, always, of what lay at the center of their isolation. A young woman, once the hope of the realm, now trapped in a body that was dissolving around her. In the final weeks of that second season of her illness, a strange resignation settled over the court. The sealing of the windows had not kept the truth from seeping out, and now there was no longer any illusion that the princess would recover. The attendants began to speak to her more openly, telling her that she was loved, that she was not forgotten, that the world outside still turned. The confessor came daily, sometimes twice in a single day. The king visited once more, sitting beside her for nearly an hour, holding her hand without speaking. When he rose to leave, those who saw his face said it looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of that hour. And still she breathed. Autumn crept upon the sealed palace in silence. Outside, the air began to cool, the nights lengthened, and the city's rhythm shifted to the tempo of harvest and preparation for winter. But none of that reached the princess's wing. Inside those bricked and boarded windows, the seasons had no meaning. The heat of summer had turned into a stale, unchanging warmth, and the air, heavy with the smell of decay, lay motionless in the rooms. The only markers of passing time were the slow alterations in her body and the deepening weariness of those who attended her. By now, the attendants no longer flinched at the sight of her. The initial shock of her condition had given way to a kind of grim familiarity. They moved about their tasks, bathing her, changing her dressings, combing what remained of her once thick hair, with quiet efficiency, speaking in low tones as though sound itself might harm her. The wounds on her skin had grown larger, their edges blackened, their centers seeping a liquid that stained every cloth it touched. Her hands, once elegant and adorned with rings, were now thin and almost translucent, the bones visible beneath the stretched skin. She slept more than she was awake, but her sleep was restless. Often she murmured or cried out, her voice hoarse and broken. Sometimes she spoke in clear sentences, asking for people who had long since died, recalling events from her childhood with startling clarity. At other times her words were jumbled, a stream of fragments that no one could make sense of. The confessor, ever faithful, continued to come daily, and sometimes during her fevered ramblings he would lean closer, as if listening for something important in her disordered speech. The court outside her chamber had grown quieter still. Many of the lesser nobles had taken their leave under various excuses: urgent matters on their estates, illnesses in their families, religious pilgrimages. Those who remained did so out of necessity, loyalty, or the inability to abandon their positions without consequence. The king kept to his private rooms, emerging only for the most pressing matters of state. Even in those rare appearances his demeanor was altered. The weight of his daughter's suffering had hollowed his cheeks, deepened the lines on his face, and dimmed his once commanding voice. Rumors continued to seep into the city, despite every effort to contain them. A merchant claimed that a cousin of his had smuggled out a scrap of cloth from the palace, a piece of a bedsheet so saturated with the princess's fluids that its odor could not be washed away. Another story told of a guard who had fainted while delivering food to the attendants, overcome by the smell before he even entered the princess's rooms. These tales, exaggerated though they might have been, served only to heighten the sense of dread surrounding the royal family. Inside the palace, the ceiling of the windows began to show its toll in other ways. Mold appeared on the walls in the damper rooms, and insects found their way in through the smallest cracks. The absence of fresh air left everyone more susceptible to illness, and coughs and fevers spread among the servants. Some fell seriously ill and were sent away, though whether they recovered was unknown. Those who remained worked longer hours to cover for the losses, their exhaustion evident in every movement. The princess's world had narrowed to such an extent that even the smallest changes became significant. One afternoon an attendant brought in a small bowl of fresh pomegranates, their ruby seeds glistening in the candlelight. The fruit had been a favorite of hers in better days, and the hope was that the sight and scent might tempt her to eat. She looked at the bowl for a long moment, then reached out a trembling hand to touch one of the seeds. It broke between her fingers, releasing its juice, and she brought the red liquid to her lips. After tasting it, she smiled faintly and said, "It tastes like summer." She ate no more, but for that brief moment her voice carried a note of the woman she had once been. The confessor later said that moments like this were a form of grace, a reminder that even in the midst of decay there could be small sparks of life. But such sparks were rare, and each one seemed to take something from her, leaving her weaker afterward. As the days shortened, the light in the princess's chambers grew dimmer. Candles and oil lamps provided the only illumination, casting long shadows on the walls. The attendants learned to read her face in this flickering light, to distinguish between the lines of pain and the lines of exhaustion. They adjusted her pillows, smoothed her hair, and held cups of water to her lips, careful not to spill a drop. Every movement was deliberate, measured, as though any sudden action might hasten the inevitable. In the court at large, talk of succession grew louder, though never in the presence of the king. The possibility that the princess might not survive the winter forced the council to consider what would happen next. Some favored a distant cousin with strong ties to the nobility. Others argued for strengthening alliances through a foreign match, should another royal daughter be found suitable. But all such discussions were conducted in whispers, behind doors that were checked twice to ensure they were shut. The king, though he did not speak of it, must have known these conversations were happening, yet he chose not to confront them. Instead, he spent his energy on ensuring that his daughter's final days, however many there might be, were as comfortable as possible. He ordered silks and fine linens to be brought in from the southern ports, even though she no longer had the strength to appreciate them. He had musicians play softly in the corridors outside her chamber, hoping the sound might soothe her, though she seemed scarcely aware of it. By November, the change in her was undeniable. Her frame had wasted further, and her skin had taken on a waxen hue. The sores had deepened to the point where bone was visible in places, and the odor from her room was so strong that even those accustomed to it found themselves gagging when they entered. The attendants now worked in pairs, both for efficiency and for mutual support, as the task of caring for her had become physically and emotionally overwhelming. One night a storm swept through the city, lashing the palace walls with rain and rattling the sealed shutters. The sound was unlike anything the princess had heard in months, and she turned her head toward it, her eyes wide. "Is that the sea?" she asked, her voice a whisper. The attendant told her it was only rain, but the princess closed her eyes and smiled. "It sounds like the sea," she said, and for the rest of the night she seemed calmer, as if the storm outside had reached her in some hidden way. The confessor took this as another sign of grace, though others wondered if it was simply the effect of hearing something from beyond the sealed world she had inhabited for so long. It was a reminder that life still existed outside those walls, that the world continued to turn, even as hers was drawing to a close. By December, the cold had begun to creep into the palace despite the sealed windows. Braziers were lit in every room, filling the air with the scent of burning charcoal. The attendants wrapped the princess in layers of blankets, careful not to let the rougher fabrics touch her damaged skin. She spoke less now, and when she did, her words were often so faint that they had to lean close to hear her. Sometimes she seemed to be speaking to people who were not there. At other times she would murmur prayers under her breath. The court had settled into a strange rhythm of waiting. Every day began with the question, had she made it through the night? Every evening ended with the same question, would she live until morning? The uncertainty was its own kind of torment, stretching nerves to the breaking point. Yet there was also a reluctance to see the end come, for her death would not only be the loss of a daughter, a princess, but the breaking of a chapter in the kingdom's story. The king visited her again shortly before Christmas. Those who saw him enter said he carried himself with the dignity of a monarch, but those who saw him leave noted the tears in his eyes. Whatever words passed between father and daughter were known only to them, but afterward the princess seemed quieter, almost peaceful, as if something had been resolved. The sealing of the windows had begun as a way to contain the physical reality of her illness, but by now it had become a symbol of the court itself. Cut off from the world, trapped in a space where time and air were stale, waiting for an ending no one could name aloud. And as the year turned, it became clear that the end was approaching, though whether it would come in days or weeks, no one could say. The new year arrived with no celebration in the palace. Outside, bells rang in the city to mark the turning of the calendar, and church choirs sang in the cold morning air, their voices drifting faintly over the rooftops. But within the sealed walls there was no music, no feasting. The princess still lay in her chamber, the slow rhythm of her breathing the only sign that life remained. The attendants had grown so used to her presence that they could not imagine the palace without her, and yet they knew that day was near. Her world had shrunk further still. She no longer had the strength to lift her head, and her eyes often stayed closed for hours at a time. When she did open them, she seemed to look past the people in the room, as though seeing something far away. Sometimes she would smile faintly at these unseen visions. Other times her brow would furrow, as if whatever she saw caused her distress. The confessor remained a constant presence, now staying for entire afternoons, reading to her from the Psalms or simply holding her hand in silence. The physical signs of her decline were unmistakable. Her skin had thinned to the point where it tore easily, and every movement had to be made with extreme care. Her hair, once a cascade of dark silk, was now sparse and brittle, falling away in clumps when brushed. The sores that had begun months ago had deepened into wounds that exposed bone in places, their edges discolored and weeping. The odor from her body was overwhelming, even for those who had grown accustomed to it, and the attendants now worked in short shifts, retreating to the outer corridors to catch their breath before returning to her side. Despite the physical reality, the princess's mind still surfaced at moments in ways that startled those around her. One evening, as the candles flickered low, she asked one of her attendants to sing an old song from her childhood. The woman, her voice trembling, began to sing a lullaby about the sea and the stars. The princess's lips moved silently along with the words, and when the song ended, she whispered, "My mother used to sing that to me." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother in weeks, and the attendant, fighting back tears, promised to sing it again the next night. The king, too, had begun to prepare himself. He had stopped asking his physicians for updates, knowing there was nothing they could say that would change what was coming. Instead, he asked the confessor to tell him about her moods, her moments of lucidity, her requests. On the rare occasions when he entered her chamber now, he would sit quietly, speaking little, his eyes fixed on her face as though trying to memorize every detail that remained. The court beyond her door had fallen into a pattern of hushed routines. Political business continued, but the energy of the palace was gone. Even the youngest pages, usually full of restless movement, moved more slowly now, their voices low. Servants crossed themselves when they passed her wing, and some left small offerings, flowers, candles, carved wooden saints, outside her door, though she never saw them. The ceiling of the windows had become not just a physical barrier, but a psychological one. The princess and her attendants lived in a world apart from the rest of the palace, their days measured not by hours, but by the slow erosion of her strength. The winter cold seeped into the stone despite the braziers kept burning in every room. The attendants bundled the princess in layers of fine linen and fur, though they avoided letting the heavier fabrics rest against her wounds. Her hands were often cold to the touch, and one attendant took to holding them gently between her own, trying to pass some warmth into her. The princess would sometimes squeeze back, a faint pressure that felt like gratitude. Then, one evening in late January, a change came. The confessor, upon entering her room, noticed that her breathing had altered, shallower, more labored. Her skin was pale with a faint, bluish tinge, and her eyes, when they opened, seemed clouded. She did not speak that night, though she listened to the prayers he read, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the ceiling. The attendants sensed it too, the shift from slow decline to the final stretch. They moved more quietly than ever, their hands gentle, their voices soft. Word reached the king, who came at once. He sat beside her for a long time, speaking to her in low tones. No one else could hear his words, but those present saw tears glisten on his cheeks. When he rose, he kissed her forehead and left, without looking at anyone else. The confessor remained behind, continuing to pray at her bedside. The following morning, she surprised them all by opening her eyes and speaking. Her voice was faint but clear. She asked to see the light. The attendants exchanged glances. They could not open the windows without undoing the months of sealing. But one of them, moved by her request, brought a small mirror from another room. She angled it to catch the sunlight from a narrow crack near the roof, reflecting it onto the princess's face. The princess closed her eyes, smiling faintly as the warmth touched her skin. "It feels like spring," she whispered. That afternoon, she seemed more alert than she had in weeks. She asked for water, which she sipped slowly, and for the lullaby to be sung again. The attendants complied, their voices trembling. The confessor later said it was as though she had gathered her remaining strength for one last day of clarity. The next morning, her breathing was weaker still. She no longer opened her eyes, and her hands lay still on the bed. The confessor began the prayers for the dying, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The attendants knelt beside the bed, each holding some part of her hand, her arm, the edge of her gown. Outside, the bells of the city's churches rang for the feast of a local saint, their sound faint through the sealed walls. She passed quietly in the late afternoon. There was no struggle, no sudden movement, just a slow exhale that did not draw in again. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the brazier in the corner. The confessor closed her eyes and made the sign of the cross over her. The attendants wept softly, their tears falling onto the fine linens that covered her. Word spread quickly through the palace. The king locked himself in his chambers, refusing to see anyone. The court moved in hushed tones, aware that they had entered a period of mourning. The sealed windows remained closed for several days, the attendants tending to her body with the utmost care. They washed her gently, dressed her in a gown of white silk, and placed a crown of fresh flowers on her head. The odor that had filled her chamber for so long was gone now, replaced by the faint scent of the herbs laid around her. When the day of her funeral came, the palace unsealed its windows for the first time in months. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the city and the cries of mourning from the crowd gathered outside. The princess's coffin, draped in the royal colors, was carried through the great hall, past rows of courtiers who bowed their heads in silence. The people who saw her pass whispered that she looked peaceful, as though she had finally escaped the suffering that had bound her for so long. The court would never be the same. The sealing of the windows had left its mark not just on the building, but on the people who had lived through it. For months they had breathed the same air, shared the same fear, endured the same waiting. They had been witnesses to a slow, relentless decay that no wealth or power could halt. And in the end, they had learned that even a princess, beloved, protected, exalted, was as fragile as any other mortal. The king ordered the windows of the palace unsealed permanently, perhaps as an act of defiance against the memory of those dark months. But the air that entered could not wash away the memory of what had happened there. For years afterward, those who had served during that time would speak of it in hushed tones, as though naming it too loudly might summon it back. The princess became a figure of whispered legend, a reminder of the limits of human power and the inevitability of decay. And so the story of the court that sealed its windows passed into history. It was told and retold, each time with new details, some imagined, some remembered. But at its heart remained the truth, that within those walls a young woman had lived and died, her beauty and promise consumed by an illness no one could stop, while the world outside went on turning. And those who had been there would never forget the stillness of that final breath, or the way the air seemed to change when the windows were opened again at last. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.